Chapter 4 of The Loss of the Titanic by Lawrence Beesley. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Chapter 4: The Sinking of the Titanic, seen from a lifeboat. Looking back now on the descent of our boat down the ship's side, it is a matter of surprise, I think, to all the occupants to remember how little they thought of it at the time. It was a great adventure, certainly. It was exciting to feel the boat sink by jerks, foot by foot, as the ropes were paid out from above and shrieked as they passed through the pulley blocks, the new ropes and gear creaking under the strain of a boat laden with people, and the crew calling to the sailors above as the boat tilted slightly, now at one end, now at the other. "Lower aft!" "Lower stern!" and "Lower together!" as she came level again, but I do not think we felt much apprehension about reaching the water safely. It was certainly thrilling to see the black hull of the ship on one side and the sea, 70 feet below, on the other, or to pass down by cabins and saloons brilliantly lighted. But we knew nothing of the apprehension felt in the minds of some of the officers whether the boats and lowering gear would stand the strain of the weight of our 60 people. The ropes, however, were new and strong, and the boat did not buckle in the middle as an older boat might have done. Whether it was right or not to lower boats full of people to the water, and it seems likely it was not, I think there can be nothing but the highest praise given to the officers and crew above for the way in which they lowered the boats, one after the other, safely to the water. It may seem a simple matter to read about such a thing, but any sailor knows, apparently, that it is not so. An experienced officer has told me that he has seen a boat lowered in practice from a ship's deck, with a trained crew and no passengers in the boat, with practiced sailors paying out the ropes, in daylight, in calm weather, with the ship lying in dock, and has seen the boat tilt over and pitch the crew headlong into the sea. Contrast these conditions with those obtaining that Monday morning at 12:45 a.m., and it is impossible not to feel that, whether the lowering crew were trained or not, whether they had or had not drilled since coming on board, they did their duty in a way that argues the greatest efficiency. I cannot help feeling the deepest gratitude to the 2 sailors who stood at the ropes above and lowered us to the sea. I do not suppose they were saved. Perhaps one explanation of our feeling little sense of the unusual in leaving the Titanic in this way was that it seemed the climax to a series of extraordinary occurrences. The magnitude of the whole thing dwarfed events that in the ordinary way would seem to be full of imminent peril. It is easy to imagine it: a voyage of 4 days on a calm sea, without a single untoward incident; the presumption, perhaps already mentally half realized, that we should be ashore in 48 hours, and so complete a splendid voyage; and then to feel the engines stop, to be summoned on deck with little time to dress, to tie on a life belt, to see rockets shooting aloft and call for help, to be told to get into a lifeboat. After all these things, it did not seem much to feel the boat sinking down to the sea. It was the natural sequence of previous events, and we had learned in the last hour to take things just as they came. At the same time, if any one should wonder what the sensation is like, it is quite easy to measure 75 feet from the windows of a tall house or a block of flats, look down to the ground, and fancy himself with some 60 other people crowded into a boat so tightly that he could not sit down or move about, and then picture the boat sinking down in a continuous series of jerks, as the sailors pay out the ropes through the cleats above. There are more pleasant sensations than this. How thankful we were that the sea was calm and the Titanic lay so steadily and quietly as we dropped down her side. We were spared the bumping and grinding against the side which so often accompanies the launching of boats. I do not remember that we even had to fend off our boat while we were trying to get free. As we went down, one of the crew shouted, "We are just over the condenser exhaust. We don't want to stay in that long or we shall be swamped. Feel down on the floor and be ready to pull up the pin which lets the ropes free as soon as we are afloat." I had often looked over the side and noticed this stream of water coming out of the side of the Titanic, just above the water line. In fact, so large was the volume of water that as we plowed along and met the waves coming towards us, this stream would cause a splash that sent spray flying. We felt, as well as we could in the crowd of people, on the floor, along the sides, with no idea where the pin could be found, and none of the crew knew where it was, only of its existence somewhere, but we never found it. And all the time we got closer to the sea and the exhaust roared nearer and nearer, until finally we floated with the ropes still holding us from above, the exhaust washing us away and the force of the tide driving us back against the side, the latter not of much account in influencing the direction, however. Thinking over what followed, I imagine we must have touched the water with the condenser stream at our bows, and not in the middle, as I thought at one time. At any rate, the resultant of these three forces was that we were carried parallel to the ship, directly under the place where boat 15 would drop from her davits into the sea. Looking up, we saw her already coming down rapidly from B deck. She must have filled almost immediately after ours. We shouted up, "Stop lowering 14!" Footnote: in an account which appeared in the newspapers of April 19th, I have described this boat as 14, not knowing they were numbered alternately. And the crew and passengers in the boat above, hearing us shout and seeing our position immediately below them, shouted the same to the sailors on the boat deck. But apparently they did not hear, for she dropped down foot by foot, 20 feet, 15, 10, and a stoker and I in the bows reached up and touched her bottom swinging above our heads, trying to push our boat from under her. It seemed now as if nothing could prevent her dropping on us, but at this moment another stoker sprang with his knife to the ropes that still held us, and I heard him shout, "1, 2," as he cut them through. The next moment we had swung away from underneath 15 and were clear of her as she dropped into the water in the space we had just before occupied. I do not know how the bow ropes were freed, but I imagine that they were cut in the same way, for we were washed clear of the Titanic at once by the force of the stream and floated away as the oars were got out. I think we all felt that that was quite the most exciting thing we had yet been through, and a great sigh of relief and gratitude went up as we swung away from the boat above our heads. But I heard no one cry aloud during the experience. Not a woman's voice was raised in fear or hysteria. I think we all learned many things that night about the bogey called fear, and how the facing of it is much less than the dread of it. The crew was made up of cooks and stewards, mostly the former, I think, their white jackets showing up in the darkness as they pulled away, two to an oar. I do not think they can have had any practice in rowing, for all night long their oars crossed and clashed. If our safety had depended on speed or accuracy in keeping time, it would have gone hard with us. Shouting began from one end of the boat to the other as to what we should do, where we should go, and no one seemed to have any knowledge how to act. At last we asked, "Who's in charge of this boat?" But there was no reply. We then agreed by general consent that the stoker who stood in the stern with the tiller should act as captain, and from that time he directed the course, shouting to the other boats and keeping in touch with them. Not that there was anywhere to go or anything we could do. Our plan of action was simple: to keep all the boats together as far as possible and wait until we were picked up by other liners. The crew had apparently heard of the wireless communications before they left the Titanic, but I never heard them say that we were in touch with any boat but the Olympic. It was always the Olympic that was coming to our rescue. They thought they knew even her distance, and making a calculation we came to the conclusion that we ought to be picked up by her about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But this was not our only hope of rescue. We watched all the time the darkness lasted for steamers' lights, thinking there might be a chance of other steamers coming near enough to see the lights which some of our boats carried. I am sure there was no feeling in the minds of anyone that we should not be picked up next day. We knew that wireless messages would go out from ship to ship, and as one of the stokers said, "The sea will be covered with ships to morrow afternoon. They will race up from all over the sea to find us." Some even thought that fast torpedo boats might run up ahead of the Olympic. And yet the Olympic was, after all, the farthest away of them all. 8 other ships lay within 300 miles of us. How thankful we should have been to know how near help was, and how many ships had heard our message and were running to the Titanic's aid. I think nothing has surprised us more than to learn so many ships were near enough to rescue us in a few hours. Almost immediately after leaving the Titanic, we saw what we all said was a ship's lights down on the horizon on the Titanic's port side. 2 lights, one above the other, and plainly not one of our boats. We even rowed in that direction for some time, but the lights drew away and disappeared below the horizon. But this is rather anticipating. We did none of these things first. We had no eyes for anything but the ship we had just left. As the oarsmen pulled slowly away, we all turned and took a long look at the mighty vessel towering high above our midget boat, and I know it must have been the most extraordinary sight I shall ever be called upon to witness. I realize now how totally inadequate language is to convey to some other person who was not there any real impression of what we saw. But the task must be attempted. The whole picture is so intensely dramatic that, while it is not possible to place on paper for eyes to see the actual likeness of the ship as she lay there, some sketch of the scene will be possible. First of all, the climatic conditions were extraordinary. The night was one of the most beautiful I have ever seen. The sky without a single cloud to mar the perfect brilliance of the stars, clustered so thickly together that in places there seemed almost more dazzling points of light set in the black sky than background of sky itself. And each star seemed, in the keen atmosphere, free from any haze, to have increased its brilliance tenfold, and to twinkle and glitter with a staccato flash that made the sky seem nothing but a setting made for them in which to display their wonder. They seemed so near, and their light so much more intense than ever before, that fancy suggested they saw this beautiful ship in dire distress below, and all their energies had awakened to flash messages across the black dome of the sky to each other, telling and warning of the calamity happening in the world beneath. Later, when the Titanic had gone down, and we lay still on the sea waiting for the day to dawn or a ship to come, I remember looking up at the perfect sky and realizing why Shakespeare wrote the beautiful words he puts in the mouth of Lorenzo: "Jessica, look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold. There's not the smallest orb which thou beholdest, but in his motion like an angel sings, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubims. Such harmony is in immortal souls. But whilst this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close it in, we cannot hear it." But it seemed almost as if we could. That night the stars seemed really to be alive and to talk. The complete absence of haze produced a phenomenon I have never seen before. Where the sky met the sea, the line was as clear and definite as the edge of a knife, so that the water and the air never merged gradually into each other and blended to a softened rounded horizon, but each element was so exclusively separate that where a star came low down in the sky near the clear cut edge of the water line, it still lost none of its brilliance. As the earth revolved, and the water edge came up and covered partially the star, as it were, it simply cut the star in two, the upper half continuing to sparkle as long as it was not entirely hidden, and throwing a long beam of light along the sea to us. In the evidence before the United States Senate Committee, the captain of one of the ships near us that night said the stars were so extraordinarily bright near the horizon that he was deceived into thinking that they were ship's lights. He did not remember seeing such a night before. Those who were afloat will all agree with that statement. We were often deceived into thinking they were lights of a ship. And next the cold air. Here again was something quite new to us. There was not a breath of wind to blow keenly round us as we stood in the boat, and because of its continued persistence to make us feel cold, it was just a keen, bitter, icy, motionless cold that came from nowhere and yet was there all the time. The stillness of it, if one can imagine cold being motionless and still, was what seemed new and strange. And these, the sky and the air, were overhead, and below was the sea. Here again something uncommon. The surface was like a lake of oil, heaving gently up and down with a quiet motion that rocked our boat dreamily to and fro. We did not need to keep her head to the swell. Often I watched her lying broadside on to the tide, and with a boat loaded as we were, this would have been impossible with anything like a swell. The sea slipped away smoothly under the boat, and I think we never heard it lapping on the sides, so oily in appearance was the water. So when one of the stokers said he had been to sea for 26 years and never yet seen such a calm night, we accepted it as true without comment. Just as expressive was the remark of another, "It reminds me of a bloomin' picnic." It was quite true. It did. A picnic on a lake, or a quiet inland river like the Cam, or a backwater on the Thames. And so in these conditions of sky and air and sea, we gazed broadside on the Titanic from a short distance. She was absolutely still. Indeed, from the first, it seemed as if the blow from the iceberg had taken all the courage out of her, and she had just come quietly to rest and was settling down without an effort to save herself, without a murmur of protest against such a foul blow. For the sea could not rock her. The wind was not there to howl noisily around her decks, and make the ropes hum. From the first, what must have impressed all as they watched was the sense of stillness about her, and the slow, insensible way she sank lower and lower in the sea, like a stricken animal. The mere bulk alone of the ship viewed from the sea below was an awe-inspiring sight. Imagine a ship nearly a sixth of a mile long, 75 feet high to the top decks, with 4 enormous funnels above the decks, and masts again high above the funnels, with her hundreds of portholes, all her saloons and other rooms brilliant with light, and all round her little boats filled with those who, until a few hours before, had trod her decks, and read in her libraries, and listened to the music of her band in happy content, and who were now looking up in amazement at the enormous mass above them, and rowing away from her because she was sinking. I had often wanted to see her from some distance away, and only a few hours before, in conversation at lunch with a fellow passenger, had registered a vow to get a proper view of her lines and dimensions when we landed at New York, to stand some distance away and take in a full view of her beautiful proportions, which the narrow approach to the dock at Southampton made impossible. Little did I think that the opportunity was to be found so quickly and so dramatically. The background, too, was a different one from what I had planned for her. The black outline of her profile against the sky was bordered all round by stars studded in the sky, and her funnels and masts were picked out in the same way. Her bulk was seen where the stars were blotted out. And one other thing was different from expectation. The thing that ripped away from us instantly, as we saw it, all sense of the beauty of the night, the beauty of the ship's lines, and the beauty of her lights. And all these taken in themselves were intensely beautiful. That thing was the awful angle made by the level of the sea with the rows of porthole lights along her side in dotted lines, row above row. The sea level and the rows of lights should have been parallel, should never have met, and now they met at an angle inside the black hull of the ship. There was nothing else to indicate she was injured. Nothing but this apparent violation of a simple geometrical law, that parallel lines should never meet even if produced ever so far both ways. But it meant the Titanic had sunk by the head until the lowest portholes in the bows were under the sea, and the portholes in the stern were lifted above the normal height. We rowed away from her in the quietness of the night, hoping and praying with all our hearts that she would sink no more and the day would find her still in the same position as she was then. The crew, however, did not think so. It has been said frequently that officers and crew felt assured that she would remain afloat even after they knew the extent of the damage. Some of them may have done so, and perhaps from their scientific knowledge of her construction, with more reason at the time than those who said she would sink. But at any rate, the stokers in our boat had no such illusion. One of them, I think he was the same man that cut us free from the pulley ropes, told us how he was at work in the stoke hole, and in anticipation of going off duty in quarter of an hour, thus confirming the time of the collision as 11:45, had near him a pan of soup keeping hot on some part of the machinery. Suddenly the whole side of the compartment came in, and the water rushed him off his feet. Picking himself up, he sprang for the compartment doorway, and was just through the aperture when the watertight door came down behind him. "Like a knife," as he said, "they work them from the bridge." He had gone up on deck, but was ordered down again at once, and with others was told to draw the fires from under the boiler, which they did, and were then at liberty to come on deck again. It seems that this particular knot of stokers must have known almost as soon as anyone the extent of injury. He added mournfully, "I could do with that hot soup now." And indeed he could. He was clad at the time of collision, he said, in trousers and singlet, both very thin on account of the intense heat in the stoke hole, and although he had added a short jacket later, his teeth were chattering with the cold. He found a place to lie down underneath the tiller on the little platform where our captain stood, and there he lay all night with a coat belonging to another stoker thrown over him, and I think he must have been almost unconscious. A lady next to him, who was warmly clad with several coats, tried to insist on his having one of hers, a fur-lined one, thrown over him, but he absolutely refused, while some of the women were insufficiently clad; and so the coat was given to an Irish girl with pretty auburn hair standing near, leaning against the gunwale, with an outside berth, and so more exposed to the cold air. This same lady was able to distribute more of her wraps to the passengers, a rug to one, a fur boa to another; and she has related with amusement that at the moment of climbing up the Carpathia's side, those to whom these articles had been lent offered them all back to her. but as, like the rest of us, she was encumbered with a life belt, she had to say she would receive them back at the end of the climb. I had not seen my dressing gown since I dropped into the boat, but sometime in the night a steerage passenger found it on the floor and put it on. It is not easy at this time to call to mind who were in the boat, because in the night it was not possible to see more than a few feet away, and when dawn came we had eyes only for the rescue ship and the icebergs. But so far as my memory serves, the list was as follows: no first class passengers, 3 women, 1 baby, 2 men from the second cabin, and the other passengers steerage, mostly women, a total of about 35 passengers. The rest, about 25, and possibly more, were crew and stokers. Near to me all night was a group of 3 Swedish girls, warmly clad, standing close together to keep warm, and very silent. Indeed, there was very little talking at any time. One conversation took place that is, I think, worth repeating. One more proof that the world, after all, is a small place. The 10-month-old baby, which was handed down at the last moment, was received by a lady next to me, the same who shared her wraps and coats. The mother had found a place in the middle and was too tightly packed to come through to the child, and so it slept contentedly for about an hour in a stranger's arms. It then began to cry, and the temporary nurse said, "Will you feel down and see if the baby's feet are out of the blanket? I don't know much about babies, but I think their feet must be kept warm." Wriggling down as well as I could, I found its toes exposed to the air, and wrapped them well up, when it ceased crying at once. It was evidently a successful diagnosis. Having recognized the lady by her voice (it was much too dark to see faces) as one of my vis-a-vis at the purser's table, I said, "Surely you are Miss ?" "Yes," she replied, "and you must be Mr. Beesley. How curious we should find ourselves in the same boat." Remembering that she had joined the boat at Queenstown, I said, "Do you know Clonmel? A letter from a great friend of mine who is staying there at giving the address, came aboard at Queenstown." "Yes, it is my home, and I was dining at just before I came away." It seemed that she knew my friend too, and we agreed that of all places in the world to recognize mutual friends, a crowded lifeboat, afloat in mid ocean at 2 a.m., 1,200 miles from our destination, was one of the most unexpected. And all the time, as we watched, the Titanic sank lower and lower by the head, and the angle became wider and wider as the stern porthole lights lifted and the bow lights sank, and it was evident she was not to stay afloat much longer. The captain's stoker now told the oarsmen to row away as hard as they could. 2 reasons seemed to make this a wise decision: one, that as she sank she would create such a wave of suction that boats, if not sucked under by being too near, would be in danger of being swamped by the wave her sinking would create; and we all knew our boat was in no condition to ride big waves, crowded as it was, and manned with untrained oarsmen. The second was that an explosion might result from the water getting to the boilers, and debris might fall within a wide radius; and yet, as it turned out, neither of these things happened. At about 2:15 a.m. I think we were any distance from a mile to 2 miles away. It is difficult for a landsman to calculate distance at sea, but we had been afloat an hour and a half, and the boat was heavily loaded, the oarsmen unskilled, and our course erratic, following now one light and now another, sometimes a star, and sometimes a light from a port lifeboat which had turned away from the Titanic in the opposite direction and lay almost on our horizon. And so we could not have gone very far away. About this time the water had crept up almost to her side light and the captain's bridge, and it seemed a question only of minutes before she sank. The oarsmen lay on their oars, and all in the lifeboat were motionless as we watched her in absolute silence, save some who would not look and buried their heads on each other's shoulders. The lights still shone with the same brilliance, but not so many of them. Many were now below the surface. I have often wondered since whether they continued to light up the cabins when the portholes were under water. They may have done so. And then, as we gazed awe-struck, she tilted slowly up, revolving apparently about a center of gravity just astern of amidships, until she attained a vertically upright position. And there she remained, motionless. As she swung up, her lights, which had shone without a flicker all night, went out suddenly, came on again for a single flash, and then went out altogether. And as they did so, there came a noise which many people, wrongly I think, have described as an explosion. It has always seemed to me that there was nothing but the engines and machinery coming loose from their bolts and bearings, and falling through the compartments, smashing everything in their way. It was partly a roar, partly a groan, partly a rattle, and partly a smash, and it was not a sudden roar as an explosion would be. It went on successively for some seconds, possibly 15 to 20, as the heavy machinery dropped down to the bottom, now the bows, of the ship. I suppose it fell through the end and sank first, before the ship. But it was a noise no one had heard before, and no one wishes to hear again. It was stupefying, stupendous, as it came to us along the water. It was as if all the heavy things one could think of had been thrown downstairs from the top of a house, smashing each other and the stairs and everything in the way. Several apparently authentic accounts have been given, in which definite stories of explosions have been related. In some cases even with wreckage blown up and the ship broken in two. But I think such accounts will not stand close analysis. In the first place, the fires had been withdrawn and the steam allowed to escape some time before she sank, and the possibility of explosion from this cause seems very remote. Then, as just related, the noise was not sudden and definite, but prolonged, more like the roll and crash of thunder. The probability of the noise being caused by engines falling down will be seen by referring to Figure 2, page 116, where the engines are placed in compartments 3, 4, and 5. As the Titanic tilted up, they would almost certainly fall loose from their bed and plunge down through the other compartments. No phenomena like that pictured in some American and English papers occurred, that of the ship breaking in two, and the two ends being raised above the surface. I saw these drawings in preparation on board the Carpathia, and said at the time that they bore no resemblance to what actually happened. When the noise was over, the Titanic was still upright like a column. We could see her now only as the stern and some 150 feet of her stood outlined against the star-specked sky, looming black in the darkness, and in this position she continued for some minutes, I think as much as 5 minutes, but it may have been less. Then, first sinking back a little at the stern, I thought, she slid slowly forwards through the water and dived slantingly down. The sea closed over her, and we had seen the last of the beautiful ship on which we had embarked 4 days before at Southampton. And in place of the ship, on which all our interest had been concentrated for so long, and towards which we looked most of the time, because it was still the only object on the sea which was a fixed point to us, in place of the Titanic, we had the level sea now stretching in an unbroken expanse to the horizon, heaving gently just as before, with no indication on the surface that the waves had just closed over the most wonderful vessel ever built by man's hand. The stars looked down just the same, and the air was just as bitterly cold. There seemed a great sense of loneliness when we were left on the sea in a small boat without the Titanic. Not that we were uncomfortable, except for the cold, nor in danger. We did not think we were either, but the Titanic was no longer there. We waded head on for the wave which we thought might come, the wave we had heard so much of from the crew, and which they said had been known to travel for miles, and it never came. But although the Titanic left us no such legacy of a wave as she went to the bottom, she left us something we would willingly forget forever, something which it is well not to let the imagination dwell on: the cries of many hundreds of our fellow passengers struggling in the ice cold water. I would willingly omit any further mention of this part of the disaster from this book, but for two reasons it is not possible. First, that as a matter of history it should be put on record, and secondly, that these cries were not only an appeal for help in the awful conditions of danger in which the drowning found themselves, an appeal that could never be answered, but an appeal to the whole world to make such conditions of danger and hopelessness impossible ever again, a cry that called to the heavens for the very injustice of its own existence, a cry that clamored for its own destruction. We were utterly surprised to hear this cry go up as the waves closed over the Titanic. We had heard no sound of any kind from her since we left her side, and, as mentioned before, we did not know how many lifeboats she had, or how many rafts. The crew may have known, but they probably did not, and if they did, they never told the passengers. We should not have been surprised to know all were safe on some life-saving device. So that unprepared as we were for such a thing, the cries of the drowning floated across the quiet sea filled us with stupefaction. We longed to return and rescue at least some of the drowning, but we knew it was impossible. The boat was filled to standing room, and to return would mean the swamping of us all. And so the captain stoker told his crew to row away from the cries. We tried to sing, to keep all from thinking of them, but there was no heart for singing in the boat at that time. The cries, which were loud and numerous at first, died away gradually one by one, but the night was clear, frosty, and still, the water smooth, and the sounds must have carried on its level surface, free from any obstruction, for miles, certainly much farther from the ship than we were situated. I think the last of them must have been heard nearly 40 minutes after the Titanic sank. Life belts would keep the survivors afloat for hours, but the cold water was what stopped the cries. There must have come to all those safe in the lifeboats, scattered round the drowning at various distances, a deep resolve that, if anything could be done by them in the future to prevent the repetition of such sounds, they would do it, at whatever cost of time or other things. And not only to them are those cries an imperative call, but to every man and woman who has known of them. It is not possible that ever again can such conditions exist, but it is a duty imperative on one and all to see that they do not. Think of it: a few more boats, a few more planks of wood nailed together in a particular way at a trifling cost, and all those men and women whom the world can so ill afford to lose would be with us to-day. There would be no mourning in thousands of homes which are now desolate, and these words need not have been written. End of chapter 4. Of the Loss of the SS Titanic by Lawrence Beesley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Chapter 5. The Rescue. All accounts agree that the Titanic sunk about 2:20 a.m. A watch in our boat gave the time as 2:30 a.m. shortly afterwards. We were then in touch with 3 other boats. One was 15, on our starboard quarter, and the others I have always supposed were 9 and 11, but I do not know definitely. We never got into close touch with each other, but called occasionally across the darkness, and saw them looming near and then drawing away again. We called to ask if any officer were aboard the other three, but did not find one. So in the absence of any plan of action, we rowed slowly forward, or what we thought was forward, for it was in the direction the Titanic's bows were pointing before she sank. I see now that we must have been pointing northwest, for we presently saw the northern lights on the starboard, and again, when the Carpathia came up from the south, we saw her from behind us on the southeast, and turned our boat around to get to her. I imagine the boats must have spread themselves over the ocean fanwise as they escaped from the Titanic, those on the starboard and port sides forward being almost dead ahead of her, and the stern boats being broadside from her. This explains why the port boats were so much longer in reaching the Carpathia, as late as 8:30 a.m., while some of the starboard boats came up as early as 4:10 a.m. Some of the port boats had to row across the place where the Titanic sank to get to the Carpathia, through the debris of chairs and wreckage of all kinds. None of the other three boats near us had a light, and we missed lights badly. We could not see each other in the darkness. We could not signal to ships which might be rushing up full speed from any quarter to the Titanic's rescue. And now we had been through so much it would seem hard to have to encounter the additional danger of being in the line of a rescuing ship. We felt again for the lantern beneath our feet, along the sides, and I managed this time to get down to the locker below the tiller platform and open it in front by removing a board, to find nothing but the zinc air tank which renders the boat unsinkable when upset. I do not think there was a light in the boat. We felt also for food and water, and found none, and came to the conclusion that none had been put in, but here we were mistaken. I have a letter from Second Officer Lightoller, in which he assures me that he and Fourth Officer Pitman examined every lifeboat from the Titanic as they lay on the Carpathia's deck afterwards, and found biscuits and water in each. Not that we wanted any food or water then. We thought of the time that might elapse before the Olympic picked us up in the afternoon. Towards 3 a.m. we saw a faint glow in the sky ahead on the starboard quarter, the first gleams, we thought, of the coming dawn. We were not certain of the time, and were eager, perhaps, to accept too readily any relief from darkness, only too glad to be able to look each other in the face and see who were our companions in good fortune, to be free from the hazard of lying in a steamer's track, invisible in the darkness. But we were doomed to disappointment. The soft light increased for a time and died away a little, glowed again, and then remained stationary for some minutes. The northern lights! It suddenly came to me, and so it was. Presently the light arched fanwise across the northern sky, with faint streamers reaching towards the pole star. I had seen them of about the same intensity in England some years ago, and knew them again. A sigh of disappointment went through the boats as we realized that the day was not yet. But had we known it, something more comforting even than the day was in store for us. All night long we had watched the horizon with eager eyes for signs of a steamer's lights. We heard from the captain stoker that the first appearance would be a single light on the horizon, the masthead light, followed shortly by a second one, lower down on the deck. If these two remained in vertical alignment, and the distance between them increased as the lights drew nearer, we might be certain it was a steamer. But what a night to see that first light on the horizon! We saw it many times as the earth revolved, and some stars rose on the clear horizon and others sank down to it. There were lights on every quarter. Some we watched and followed until we saw the deception and grew wiser. Some were lights from those of our boats that were fortunate enough to have lanterns, but these were generally easily detected, as they rose and fell in the near distance. Once they raised our hopes, only to sink them to zero again. Near what seemed to be the horizon, on the port quarter, we saw two lights close together, and thought this must be our double light, but as we gazed across the miles that separated us, the lights slowly drew apart, and we realized that they were two boats' lanterns at different distances from us, in line, one behind the other. They were probably the forward port boats that had to return so many miles next morning across the Titanic's graveyard. But notwithstanding these hopes and disappointments, the absence of lights, food and water, as we thought, and the bitter cold, it would not be correct to say we were unhappy in those early morning hours. The cold that settled down on us like a garment that wraps close around was the only real discomfort, and that we could keep at bay by not thinking too much about it, as well as by vigorous friction and gentle stamping on the floor. It made too much noise to stamp hard. I never heard that any one in boat B had any effects from the cold. Even the stoker, who was so thinly clad, came through without harm. After all, there were many things to be thankful for, so many that they made insignificant the temporary inconvenience of the cold, the crowded boat, the darkness, and the 101 things that in the ordinary way we might regard as unpleasant. The quiet sea, the beautiful night, how different from 2 nights later, when flashes of lightning and peals of thunder broke the sleep of many on board the Carpathia! And above all, the fact of being in a boat at all when so many of our fellow passengers and crew, whose cries no longer moaned across the water to us, were silent in the water. Gratitude was the dominant note in our feelings then, but grateful as we were, our gratitude was soon to be increased 100-fold. About 3:30 A.M., as nearly as I can judge, someone in the bow called our attention to a faint, far-away gleam in the southeast. We all turned quickly to look, and there it was certainly, streaming up from behind the horizon, like a distant flash of a warship's searchlight, then a faint boom, like guns afar off, and the light died away again. The stoker, who had lain all night under the tiller, sat up suddenly as if from a dream, the overcoat hanging from his shoulders. I can see him now, staring out across the sea, to where the sound had come from, and hear him shout, "That was a cannon!" But it was not. It was the Carpathia's rocket, though we did not know it until later. But we did know now that something was not far away, racing up to our help, and signalling to us a preliminary message to cheer our hearts until she arrived. With every sense alert, eyes gazing intently at the horizon, and ears open for the least sound, we waited in absolute silence on the quiet night. And then, creeping over the edge of the sea where the flash had been, we saw a single light, and presently a second below it, and in a few minutes they were well above the horizon, and they remained in line. But we had been deceived before, and we waited a little longer before we allowed ourselves to say we were safe. The lights came up rapidly, so rapidly it seemed only a few minutes, though it must have been longer, between first seeing them and finding them well above the horizon and bearing down rapidly on us. We did not know what sort of a vessel was coming, but we knew she was coming quickly, and we searched for paper, rags, anything that would burn. We were quite prepared to burn our coats if necessary. A hasty paper torch was twisted out of letters found in someone's pocket, lighted, and held aloft by the stoker standing on the tiller platform. The little light shone in flickers on the faces of the occupants of the boat, ran in broken lines for a few yards along the black oily sea, where, for the first time, I saw the presence of that awful thing which had caused the whole terrible disaster: ice, in little chunks the size of one's fist, bobbing harmlessly up and down. and spluttered away to blackness again as the stoker threw the burning remnants of paper overboard. But had we known it, the danger of being run down was already over, one reason being that the Carpathia had already seen the lifeboat, which all night long had shown a green light, the first indication the Carpathia had of our position. But the real reason is to be found in the Carpathia's log. Went full speed ahead during the night. Stopped at 4 a.m. with an iceberg dead ahead. It was a good reason. With our torch burnt and in darkness again, we saw the headlights stop, and realized that the rescuer had hove to. A sigh of relief went up when we thought no hurried scramble had to be made to get out of her way, with a chance of just being missed by her, and having to meet the wash of her screws as she tore by us. We waited, and she slowly swung round and revealed herself to us as a large steamer with all her portholes alight. I think the way those lights came slowly into view was one of the most wonderful things we shall ever see. It meant deliverance at once. That was the amazing thing to us all. We had thought of the afternoon as our time of rescue, and here, only a few hours after the Titanic sank, before it was yet light, we were to be taken aboard. It seemed almost too good to be true, and I think everyone's eyes filled with tears, men's as well as women's, as they saw again the rows of lights, one above the other, shining kindly to them across the water, and "Thank God" was murmured in heartfelt tones around the boat. The boat swung round and the crew began their long row to the steamer. The captain called for a song and led off with "Pull for the shore, boys." The crew took it up quaveringly, and the passengers joined in, but I think one verse was all they sang. It was too early yet. Gratitude was too deep and sudden in its overwhelming intensity for us to sing very steadily. Presently, finding the song had not gone very well, we tried a cheer, and that went better. It was more easy to relieve our feelings with a noise, and time and tune were not necessary ingredients in a cheer. In the midst of our thankfulness for deliverance, one name was mentioned with the deepest feeling of gratitude, that of Marconi. I wish he had been here to hear the chorus of gratitude that went out to him for the wonderful invention that spared us many hours, and perhaps many days, of wandering about the sea in hunger and storm and cold. Perhaps our gratitude was sufficiently intense and vivid to Marconi some of it to him that night. All around we saw boats making for the Carpathia, and heard their shouts and cheers. Our crew rowed hard in friendly rivalry with other boats to be among the first home, but we must have been 8th or 9th at the side. We had a heavy load aboard, and had to row round a huge iceberg on the way. And then, as if to make everything complete for our happiness, came the dawn. First a beautiful quiet shimmer away in the east, then a soft golden glow that crept up stealthily from behind the skyline, as if it were trying not to be noticed, as it stole over the sea, and spread itself quietly in every direction, so quietly as if to make us believe it had been there all the time and we had not observed it. The sky turned faintly pink, and in the distance the thinnest, fleeciest clouds stretched in thin bands across the horizon, and close down to it, becoming every moment more and more pink. And next the stars died, slowly, save one which remained long after the others just above the horizon, and near by, with the crescent turned to the north, and the lower horn just touching the horizon, the thinnest, palest of moons. And with the dawn came a faint breeze from the west, the first breath of wind we had felt since the Titanic stopped her engines. Anticipating a few hours, as the day drew on to 8 a.m., the time the last boats came up, this breeze increased to a fresh wind which whipped up the sea, so that the last boat laden with people had an anxious time in the choppy waves before they reached the Carpathia. An officer remarked that one of the boats could not have stayed afloat another hour. The wind had held off just long enough. The captain shouted along our boat to the crew as they strained at the oars, two pulling and an extra one facing them and pushing to try to keep pace with the other boats. "A new moon! Turn your money over, boys! That is, if you have any." We laughed at him for the quaint superstition at such a time, but it was good to laugh again, and he showed his disbelief in another superstition when he added, "Well, I shall never say again that 13 is an unlucky number. Boat 13 is the best friend we ever had." If there had been among us, and it is almost certain that there were, so fast does superstition cling, those who feared events connected with the number 13, I am certain they agreed with him, and never again will they attach any importance to such a foolish belief. Perhaps the belief itself will receive a shock when it is remembered that boat 13 of the Titanic brought away a full load from the sinking vessel, carried them in such comfort all night that they had not even a drop of water on them, and landed them safely at the Carpathia's side, where they climbed aboard without a single mishap. It almost tempts one to be the 13th at table, or to choose a house numbered 13, fearless of any croaking about flying in the face of what is humorously called Providence. Looking towards the Carpathia in the faint light, we saw what seemed to be two large, fully rigged sailing ships near the horizon, with all sails set, standing up near her, but we decided that they must be fishing vessels off the banks of Newfoundland, which had seen the Carpathia stop, and were waiting to see if she wanted help of any kind. But in a few minutes more the light shone on them, and they stood revealed as huge icebergs, peaked in a way that readily suggested a ship. When the sun rose higher, it turned them pink, and sinister as they looked, towering like rugged white peaks of rock out of the sea, and terrible as was the disaster one of them had caused, there was an awful beauty about them which could not be overlooked. Later, when the sun came above the horizon, they sparkled and glittered in its rays, deadly white, like frozen snow rather than translucent ice. As the dawn crept towards us, there lay another almost directly in the line between our boat and the Carpathia, and a few minutes later another on her port quarter, and more again on the southern and western horizons, as far as the eye could reach, all differing in shape and size and tones of color according as the sun shone through them or was reflected directly or obliquely from them. We drew near our rescuer, and presently could discern the bands on her funnel, by which the crew could tell she was a Cunarder, and already some boats were at her side and passengers climbing up her ladders. We had to give the iceberg a wide berth and make a detour to the south. We knew it was sunk a long way below the surface, with such things as projecting ledges. Not that it was very likely there was one so near the surface as to endanger our small boat, but we were not inclined to take any risks for the sake of a few more minutes when safety lay so near. Once clear of the berg, we could read the Cunarder's name, Carpathia, a name we are not likely ever to forget. We shall see her sometimes, perhaps in the shipping lists, as I have done already once when she left Genoa on her return voyage, and the way her lights climbed up over the horizon in the darkness, the way she swung and showed her lighted portholes, and the moment when we read her name on her side will all come back in a flash. We shall live again the scene of rescue and feel the same thrill of gratitude for all she brought us that night. We rowed up to her about 4:30, and sheltering on the port side from the swell, held on by two ropes at the stern and bow. Women went up the side first, climbing rope ladders with a noose round their shoulders to help their ascent. Men passengers scrambled next, and the crew last of all. The baby went up in a bag with the opening tied up, It had been quite well all the time, and never suffered any ill effects from its cold journey in the night. We set foot on deck with very thankful hearts, grateful beyond the possibility of adequate expression to feel a solid ship beneath us once more. Chapter 6 of The Loss of the S.S. Titanic by Lawrence Beesley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Chapter 6: The Sinking of the Titanic Seen from Her Deck. The two preceding chapters have been to a large extent the narrative of a single eyewitness and an account of the escape of one boat only from the Titanic's side. It will be well now to return to the Titanic and reconstruct a more general and complete account from the experiences of many people in different parts of the ship. A considerable part of these experiences was related to the writer first hand by survivors, both on board the Carpathia and at other times, but some are derived from other sources which are probably as accurate as first hand information. Other reports, which seemed at first sight to have been founded on the testimony of eyewitnesses, have been found on examination to have passed through several hands and have therefore been rejected. The testimony even of eyewitnesses has in some cases been excluded when it seemed not to agree with direct evidence of a number of other witnesses or with what reasoned judgment considered probable in the circumstances. In this category are the reports of explosions before the Titanic sank, the breaking of the ship in two parts, the suicide of officers. It would be well to notice here that the Titanic was in her correct course, the southerly one, and in the position which prudence dictates as a safe one under the ordinary conditions at that time of the year. To be strictly accurate, she was 16 miles south of the regular summer route which all companies follow from January to August. Perhaps the real history of the disaster should commence with the afternoon of Sunday, when marconigrams were received by the Titanic from the ships ahead of her, warning her of the existence of icebergs. In connection with this must be taken the marked fall of temperature observed by everyone in the afternoon and evening of this day, as well as the very low temperature of the water. These have generally been taken to indicate that without any possibility of doubt we were near an iceberg region, and the severest condemnation has been poured on the heads of the officers and captain for not having regard to these climatic conditions. But here caution is necessary. There can be little doubt now that the low temperature observed can be traced to the icebergs and ice field subsequently encountered, but experienced sailors are aware that it might have been observed without any icebergs being near. The cold Labrador current sweeps down by Newfoundland across the track of Atlantic liners, but does not necessarily carry icebergs with it. Cold winds blow from Greenland to Labrador, and not always from icebergs and ice fields, so that falls in temperature of sea and air are not prima facie evidence of the close proximity of icebergs. On the other hand, a single iceberg separated by many miles from its fellows might sink a ship, but certainly would not cause a drop in temperature either of the air or water. Then, as the Labrador current meets the warm Gulf Stream flowing from the Gulf of Mexico across to Europe, they do not necessarily intermingle, nor do they always run side by side or one on top of the other, but often interlaced, like the fingers of two hands. As a ship sails across this region, the thermometer will record within a few miles temperatures of 34 degrees, 58 degrees, 35 degrees, 59 degrees, and so on. It is little wonder, then, that sailors become accustomed to place little reliance on temperature conditions as a means of estimating the probabilities of encountering ice in their track. An experienced sailor has told me that nothing is more difficult to diagnose than the presence of icebergs. and a strong confirmation of this is found in the official sailing directions issued by the Hydrographic Department of the British Admiralty. No reliance can be placed on any warning being conveyed to the mariner, by a fall in temperature, either of sea or air, of approaching ice. Some decrease in temperature has occasionally been recorded, but more often none has been observed. But notification by marconigram of the exact location of icebergs is a vastly different matter. I remember with deep feeling the effect this information had on us when it first became generally known on board the Carpathia. Rumors of it went round on Wednesday morning, grew to definite statements in the afternoon, and were confirmed when one of the Titanic officers admitted the truth of it in reply to a direct question. I shall never forget the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that came over some of us as we obtained definite knowledge of the warning messages. It was not then the unavoidable accident that we had hitherto supposed. The sudden plunging into a region crowded with icebergs which no seaman, however skilled a navigator he might be, could have avoided. The beautiful Titanic wounded too deeply to recover, the cries of the drowning still ringing in our ears, and the thousands of homes that mourned all these calamities. None of these things need ever have been. It is no exaggeration to say that men who went through all the experiences of the collision and the rescue, and the subsequent scenes on the quay at New York with hardly a tremor, were quite overcome by this knowledge, and turned away, unable to speak. I for one did so, and I know others who told me they were similarly affected. I think we all came to modify our opinions on this matter, however, when we learned more of the general conditions attending transatlantic steamship services. The discussion as to who was responsible for these warnings being disregarded had perhaps better be postponed to a later chapter. One of these warnings was handed to Mr. Ismay by Captain Smith at 5:00 p.m. and returned at the latter's request at 7 p.m., that it might be posted for the information of officers. As a result of the messages, they were instructed to keep a special lookout for ice. This Second Officer Lightoller did until he was relieved at 10 p.m. by First Officer Murdoch, to whom he handed on the instructions. During Mr. Lightoller's watch, about 9 p.m., the captain had joined him on the bridge and discussed the time we should be getting up towards the vicinity of ice, and how we should recognize it if we should see it, and refreshing our minds on the indications that ice gives when it is in the vicinity. Apparently, too, the officers had discussed among themselves the proximity of ice, and Mr. Lightoller had remarked that they would be approaching the position where ice had been reported during his watch. The lookouts were cautioned similarly, but no ice was sighted until a few minutes before the collision, when the lookout man saw the iceberg and rang the bell 3 times, the usual signal from the crow's nest when anything is seen dead ahead. By telephone he reported to the bridge the presence of an iceberg, but Mr. Murdoch had already ordered Quartermaster Hitchens at the wheel to starboard the helm, and the vessel began to swing away from the berg. But it was far too late at the speed she was going to hope to steer the huge Titanic, over a sixth of a mile long, out of reach of danger. Even if the iceberg had been visible half a mile away, it is doubtful whether some portion of her tremendous length would not have been touched, and it is in the highest degree unlikely that the lookout could have seen the berg half a mile away in the conditions that existed that night, even with glasses. The very smoothness of the water made the presence of ice a more difficult matter to detect. In ordinary conditions the dash of the waves against the foot of an iceberg surrounds it with a circle of white foam visible for some distance, long before the iceberg itself. But here was an oily sea sweeping smoothly round the deadly monster and causing no indication of its presence. There is little doubt, moreover, that the crow's nest is not a good place from which to detect icebergs. It is proverbial that they adopt to a large extent the color of their surroundings, and seen from above at a high angle, with the black, foam-free sea behind, the iceberg must have been almost invisible until the Titanic was close upon it. I was much struck by a remark of Sir Ernest Shackleton on his method of detecting icebergs: to place a lookout man as low down near the water line as he could get him. Remembering how we had watched the Titanic with all her lights out, standing upright like an enormous black finger, as one observer stated, and had only seen her thus because she loomed black against the sky behind her, I saw at once how much better the sky was than the black sea to show up an iceberg's bulk. And so in a few moments the Titanic had run obliquely on the berg, and with a shock that was astonishingly slight, so slight that many passengers never noticed it, the submerged portion of the berg had cut her open on the starboard side in the most vulnerable portion of her anatomy, the bilge. The most authentic accounts say that the wound began at about the location of the foremast and extended far back to the stern, the brunt of the blow being taken by the forward plates, which were either punctured through both bottoms directly by the blow, or through one skin only, and as this was torn away it ripped out some of the inner plates. The fact that she went down by the head shows that probably only the forward plates were doubly punctured, the stern ones being cut open through the outer skin only. After the collision, Murdock had at once reversed the engines and brought the ship to a standstill, but the iceberg had floated away astern. The shock, though little felt by the enormous mass of the ship, was sufficient to dislodge a large quantity of ice from the berg. The forecastle deck was found to be covered with pieces of ice. Feeling the shock, Captain Smith rushed out of his cabin to the bridge, and in reply to his anxious inquiry was told by Murdock that ice had been struck and the emergency doors instantly closed. The officers roused by the collision went on deck, some to the bridge, others, while hearing nothing of the extent of the damage, saw no necessity for doing so. Captain Smith at once sent the carpenter below to sound the ship, and Fourth Officer Boxhall to the steerage to report damage. The latter found there a very dangerous condition of things and reported to Captain Smith, who then sent him to the mail room. And here again it was easy to see matters looked very serious. Mail bags were floating about and the water rising rapidly. All this was reported to the captain, who ordered the lifeboats to be got ready at once. Mr. Boxhall went to the chart room to work out the ship's position, which he then handed to the Marconi operators for transmission to any ship near enough to help in the work of rescue. Reports of the damage done were by this time coming to the captain from many quarters, from the chief engineer, from the designer, Mr. Andrews, and in a dramatic way from the sudden appearance on deck of a swarm of stokers who had rushed up from below as the water poured into the boiler rooms and the coal bunkers. They were immediately ordered down below to duty again. Realizing the urgent need of help, he went personally to the Marconi room and gave orders to the operators to get in touch with all the ships they could and to tell them to come quickly. The assistant operator Bride had been asleep and knew of the damage only when Phillips, in charge of the Marconi room, told him ice had been encountered. They started to send out the well-known CQD message, which interpreted means CQ, all stations attend, and D, distress, the position of the vessel in latitude and longitude following. Later they sent out SOS, an arbitrary message agreed upon as an international code signal. Soon after the vessel struck, Mr. Ismay had learned of the nature of the accident from the captain and chief engineer, and after dressing and going on deck had spoken to some of the officers not yet thoroughly acquainted with the grave injury done to the vessel. By this time All those in any way connected with the management and navigation must have known the importance of making use of all the ways of safety known to them, and that without any delay. That they thought at first that the Titanic would sink as soon as she did is doubtful, but probably as the reports came in they knew that her ultimate loss in a few hours was a likely contingency. On the other hand, there is evidence that some of the officers in charge of boats quite expected the embarkation was a precautionary measure and they would all return after daylight. Certainly, the first information that ice had been struck conveyed to those in charge no sense of the gravity of the circumstances. One officer even retired to his cabin, and another advised a steward to go back to his berth as there was no danger. And so the order was sent round, all passengers on deck with lifebelts on. And in obedience to this a crowd of hastily dressed or partially dressed people began to assemble on the decks belonging to their respective classes, except the steerage passengers, who were allowed access to other decks, tying on lifebelts over their clothing. In some part of the ship women were separated from the men and assembled together near the boats. In others, men and women mingled freely together, husbands helping their own wives and families, and then other women and children into the boats. The officers spread themselves about the decks, superintending the work of lowering and loading the boats, and in 3 cases were ordered by their superior officers to take charge of them. At this stage great difficulty was experienced in getting women to leave the ship, especially where the order was so rigorously enforced, women and children only. Women in many cases refused to leave their husbands and were actually forcibly lifted up and dropped in the boats. They argued with the officers, demanding reasons, and in some cases, even when induced to get in, were disposed to think the whole thing a joke or a precaution which it seemed to them rather foolish to take. In this they were encouraged by the men left behind, who, in the same condition of ignorance, said good-bye to their friends as they went down, adding that they would see them again at breakfast time. To illustrate further how little danger was apprehended when it was discovered on the first class deck that the forward lower deck was covered with small ice, snowballing matches were arranged for the following morning, and some passengers even went down to the deck and brought back small pieces of ice which were handed round. Below decks, too, was additional evidence that no one thought of immediate danger. 2 ladies walking along one of the corridors came across a group of people gathered round a door which they were trying vainly to open, and on the other side of which a man was demanding in loud terms to be let out. Either his door was locked and the key not to be found, or the collision had jammed the lock and prevented the key from turning. The ladies thought he must be afflicted in some way to make such a noise, but one of the men was assuring him that in no circumstances should he be left, and that the bystander's son would be along soon and would smash down his door if it was not opened in the meantime. "He has a stronger arm than I have," he added. The son arrived presently and proceeded to make short work of the door. It was smashed in and the inmate released, to his great satisfaction, and with many expressions of gratitude to his rescuer. But one of the head stewards, who came up at this juncture, was so incensed at the damage done to the property of his company, and so little aware of the infinitely greater damage done the ship, that he warned the man who had released the prisoner that he would be arrested on arrival in New York. It must be borne in mind that no general warning had been issued to passengers. Here and there were experienced travelers, to whom collision with an iceberg was sufficient to cause them to make every preparation for leaving the ship, but the great majority were never enlightened as to the amount of damage done, or even as to what had happened. We knew in a vague way that we had collided with an iceberg, but there our knowledge ended, and most of us drew no deductions from that fact alone. Another factor that prevented some from taking to the boats was the drop to the water below, and the journey into the unknown sea. Certainly it looked like a tremendous way down in the darkness, and the sea and the night both seemed very cold and lonely. And here was the ship, so firm and well lighted and warm. But perhaps what made so many people declare their decision to remain was their strong belief in the theory of the Titanic's unsinkable construction. Again and again it was repeated, "This ship cannot sink. It is only a question of waiting until another ship comes up and takes us off." Husbands expected to follow their wives and join them either in New York or by transfer in mid-ocean from steamer to steamer. Many passengers relate that they were told by officers that the ship was a lifeboat and could not go down. One lady affirms that the captain told her the Titanic could not sink for 2 or 3 days. No doubt this was immediately after the collision. It is not any wonder then that many elected to remain, deliberately choosing the deck of the Titanic to a place in a lifeboat. And yet the boats had to go down, and so at first they went half full. This is the real explanation of why they were not as fully loaded as the later ones. It is important then to consider the question how far the captain was justified in withholding all the knowledge he had from every passenger. From one point of view he should have said to them, "This ship will sink in a few hours. There are the boats, and only women and children can go to them." But had he the authority to enforce such an order? There are such things as panics and rushes which get beyond the control of a handful of officers, even if armed, and where even the bravest of men get swept off their feet, mentally as well as physically. On the other hand, if he decided to withhold all definite knowledge of danger from all passengers, and at the same time persuade, and if it was not sufficient, compel, women and children to take to the boats, it might result in their all being saved. He could not foresee the tenacity of their faith in the boat. There is ample evidence that he left the bridge when the ship had come to rest, and went among the passengers, urging them to get into the boat, and rigorously excluding all but women and children. Some would not go. Officer Lowe testified that he shouted, "Who's next for the boat?" and could get no replies. The boats even were sent away half loaded, although the fear of their buckling in the middle was responsible as well for this. But the captain with the few boats at his disposal could hardly do more than persuade and advise in the terrible circumstances in which he was placed. How appalling to think that with a few more boats, and the ship was provided with that particular kind of davit that would launch more boats, there would have been no decision of that kind to make. It could have been stated plainly, "This ship will sink in a few hours. There is room in the boats for all passengers, beginning with women and children." Poor Captain Smith! I care not whether the responsibility for such speed in an iceberg region will rest on his shoulders or not. No man ever had to make such a choice as he had that night, and it seems difficult to see how he can be blamed for withholding from passengers such information as he had of the danger that was imminent. When one reads in the press that lifeboats arrived at the Carpathia half full, it seems at first sight a dreadful thing that this should have been allowed to happen. But it is so easy to make these criticisms afterwards, so easy to say that Captain Smith should have told everyone of the condition of the vessel. He was faced with many conditions that night which such criticism overlooks. Let any fair-minded person consider some few of the problems presented to him. The ship was bound to sink in a few hours. There was lifeboat accommodation for all women and children and some men. There was no way of getting some women to go except by telling them the ship was doomed, a course he deemed it best not to take. And he knew the danger of boats buckling when loaded full. His solution of these problems was apparently the following: to send the boats down half full, with such women as would go, and to tell the boats to stand by to pick up more passengers passed down from the cargo ports. There is good evidence that this was part of the plan. I heard an officer give the order to 4 boats, and a lady in number 4 boat on the port side tells me the sailors were so long looking for the port where the captain personally had told them to wait that they were in danger of being sucked under by the vessel. How far any systematic attempt was made to stand by the ports I do not know. I never saw one open or any boat standing near on the starboard side, but then boats 9 to 15 went down full, and on reaching the sea rowed away at once. There is good evidence, then, that Captain Smith fully intended to load the boats full in this way. The failure to carry out the intention is one of the things the whole world regrets, but consider again the great size of the ship and the short time to make decisions, and the omission is more easily understood. The fact is that such a contingency as lowering away boats was not even considered beforehand, and there is much cause for gratitude that as many as 705 people were rescued. The whole question of a captain's duties seems to require revision. It was totally impossible for any one man to attempt to control the ship that night, and the weather conditions could not well have been more favorable for doing so. One of the reforms that seems inevitable is that one man shall be responsible for the boats, their manning, loading and lowering, leaving the captain free to be on the bridge to the last moment. But to return for a time to the means taken to attract the notice of other ships. The wireless operators were now in touch with several ships and calling to them to come quickly, for the water was pouring in and the Titanic beginning to go down by the head. Bride testified that the first reply received was from a German boat, the Frankfurt, which was "all right, stand by," but not giving her position. From comparison of the strength of signals received from the Frankfurt and from other boats, the operators estimated the Frankfurt was the nearest, but subsequent events proved that this was not so. She was, in fact, 140 miles away, and arrived at 10:50 a.m. next morning, when the Carpathia had left with the rescued. The next reply was from the Carpathia, 58 miles away, on the outbound route to the Mediterranean, and it was a prompt and welcome one, "coming hard," followed by the position. Then followed the Olympic, and with her they talked for some time, but she was 560 miles away on the southern route, too far to be of any immediate help. At the speed of 23 knots she would expect to be about 1 p.m. next day, and this was about the time that those in boat 13 had calculated. We had always assumed in the boat that the stokers who gave this information had it from one of the officers before they left, but in the absence of any knowledge of the much nearer ship, the Carpathia, it is more probable that they knew in a general way where the sister ship, the Olympic, should be, and had made a rough calculation. Other ships in touch by wireless were the Mount Temple, 50 miles, the Burma, 100 miles, the Parisian, 150 miles, the Virginian, 150 miles, and the Baltic, 300 miles. But closer than any of these, closer even than the Carpathia, were 2 ships, the Californian, less than 20 miles away, with the wireless operator off duty and unable to catch the CQD signal, which was now making the air for many miles around quiver in its appeal for help, immediate, urgent help, for the hundreds of people who stood on the Titanic's deck. The second vessel was a small steamer some few miles ahead on the port side, without any wireless apparatus, her name and destination still unknown. And yet the evidence for her presence that night seems too strong to be disregarded. Mr. Boxhall states that he and Captain Smith saw her quite plainly some 5 miles away, and could distinguish the masthead lights and a red port light. They at once hailed her with rockets and Morse electric signals, to which Boxhall saw no reply, but Captain Smith and stewards affirmed they did. The second and third officers saw the signal sent and her lights, the latter from the lifeboat of which he was in charge. Seaman Hopkins testified that he was told by the captain to row for the light, and we in boat 13 certainly saw it in the same position and rowed towards it for some time. But notwithstanding all the efforts made to attract its attention, it drew slowly away, and the lights sank below the horizon. The pity of it! So near, and so many people waiting for the shelter its decks could have given so easily. It seems impossible to think that this ship ever replied to the signals. Those who said so must have been mistaken. The United States Senate Committee, in its report, does not hesitate to say that this unknown steamer and the Californian are identical, and that the failure on the part of the latter to come to help of the Titanic is culpable negligence. There is undoubted evidence that some of the crew on the Californian saw our rockets, but it seems impossible to believe that the captain and officers knew of our distress and deliberately ignored it. Judgment on the matter had better be suspended until further information is forthcoming. An engineer who has served in the transatlantic service tells me that it is a common practice for small boats to leave the fishing smacks to which they belong and row away for miles, sometimes even being lost and wandering about among icebergs, and even not being found again. In these circumstances, rockets are part of a fishing smack's equipment, and are sent up to indicate to the small boats how to return. Is it conceivable that the Californian thought our rockets were such signals, and therefore paid no attention to them? Incidentally, this engineer did not hesitate to add that it is doubtful if a big liner would stop to help a small fishing boat sending off distress signals, or even would turn about to help one which she herself had cut down, as it lay in her path without a light. He was strong in his affirmation that such things were commonly known to all officers in the transatlantic service. With regard to the other vessels in wireless communication, the Mount Temple was the only one near enough from the point of distance to have arrived in time to be of help, but between her and the Titanic lay the enormous ice floe, and icebergs were near her in addition. The 7 ships which caught the message started at once to help, but were all stopped on the way, except the Burma, by the Carpathia's wireless announcing the fate of the Titanic and the people aboard her. The message must have affected the captains of these ships very deeply. They would understand far better than the traveling public what it meant to lose such a beautiful ship on her first voyage. The only thing now left to be done was to get the lifeboats away as quickly as possible, and to this task the other officers were in the meantime devoting all their endeavors. Mr. Lightoller sent away boat after boat. In one he had put 24 women and children, in another 30, in another 35, and then, running short of seamen to man the boats, he sent Major Peuchen, an expert yachtsman, in the next, to help with its navigation. By the time these had been filled, he had difficulty in finding women for the 5th and 6th boats, for the reasons already stated. All this time the passengers remained, to use his own expression, as quiet as if in church. To man and supervise the loading of 6 boats must have taken him nearly up to the time of the Titanic's sinking, taking an average of some 20 minutes to a boat. Still at work to the end, he remained on the ship till she sank, and went down with her. His evidence before the United States Committee was as follows: Did you leave the ship? No, sir. Did the ship leave you? Yes, sir. It was a piece of work well and cleanly done, and his escape from the ship, one of the most wonderful of all, seems almost a reward for his devotion to duty. Captain Smith, Officers Wild and Murdock were similarly engaged in other parts of the ship, urging women to get in the boats, in some cases directing junior officers to go down in some of them. Officers Pittman, Boxhall, and Lowe were sent in this way, and others placing members of the crew in charge. As the boats were lowered, orders were shouted to them where to make for. Some were told to stand by and wait for further instructions, others to row for the light of the disappearing steamer. It is a pitiful thing to recall the effects of sending down the first boats half full. In some cases, men in the company of their wives had actually taken seats in the boats, young men, married only a few weeks and on their wedding trip, and had done so only because no more women could then be found. But the strict interpretation by the particular officer in charge there of the rule of "women and children only" compelled them to get out again. Some of these boats were lowered and reached the Carpathia with many vacant seats. The anguish of the young wives in such circumstances can only be imagined. In other parts of the ship, however, a different interpretation was placed on the rule, and men were allowed and even invited by officers to get in, not only to form part of the crew, but even as passengers. This, of course, in the first boats, and when no more women could be found. The varied understanding of this rule was a frequent subject of discussion on the Carpathia. In fact, the rule itself was debated with much heart-searching. There were not wanting many who doubted the justice of its rigid enforcement, who could not think it well that a husband should be separated from his wife and family, leaving them penniless, or a young bridegroom from his wife of a few short weeks, while ladies with few relatives, with no one dependent upon them, and few responsibilities of any kind, were saved. It was mostly these ladies who pressed this view, and even men seemed to think there was a good deal to be said for it. Perhaps there is, theoretically, but it would be impossible, I think, in practice. To quote Mr. Lightoller again in his evidence before the United States Senate Committee, when asked if it was a rule of the sea that women and children be saved first, he replied, "No, it is a rule of human nature." That is no doubt the real reason for its existence. But the selective process of circumstances brought about results that were very bitter to some. It was heart-rending for ladies who had lost all they held dearest in the world to hear that in one boat was a stoker picked up out of the sea, so drunk that he stood up and brandished his arms about, and had to be thrown down by ladies and sat upon to keep him quiet. If comparisons can be drawn, it did seem better that an educated, refined man should be saved than one who had flown to drink as his refuge in time of danger. These discussions turned sometimes to the old inquiry, what is the purpose of all this? Why the disaster? Why this man saved and that man lost? Who has arranged that my husband should live a few short happy years in the world, and the happiest days in those years with me these last few weeks, and then be taken from me? I heard no one attribute all this to a divine power who ordains and arranges the lives of men, and as part of a definite scheme sends such calamity and misery in order to purify, to teach, to spiritualize. I do not say there were not people who thought and said they saw divine wisdom in it all, so inscrutable that we in our ignorance saw it not, but I did not hear it expressed, and this book is intended to be no more than a partial chronicle of the many different experiences and convictions. There were those, on the other hand, who did not fail to say emphatically that indifference to the rights and feelings of others, blindness to duty towards our fellow men and women, was in the last analysis the cause of most of the human misery in the world, and it should undoubtedly appeal more to our sense of justice to attribute these things to our own lack of consideration for others than to shift the responsibility onto a power whom we first postulate as being all-wise and all-loving. All the boats were lowered and sent away by 2 a.m., and by this time the ship was very low in the water, the forecastle deck completely submerged, and the sea creeping steadily up to the bridge and probably only a few yards away. No one on the ship can have had any doubt now as to her ultimate fate, and yet the 1,500 passengers and crew on board made no demonstration, and not a sound came from them as they stood quietly on the decks or went about their duties below. It seems incredible, and yet if it was a continuation of the same feeling that existed on deck before the boats left, and I have no doubt that it was, the explanation is straightforward and reasonable in its simplicity. An attempt is made in the last chapter to show why the attitude of the crowd was so quietly courageous. There are accounts which picture excited crowds running about the deck in terror, fighting and struggling. But two of the most accurate observers, Colonel Gracie and Mr. Lightoller, affirm that this was not so, that absolute order and quietness prevailed. The band still played to cheer the hearts of all near. The engineers and their crew I have never heard anyone speak of a single engineer being seen on deck still worked at the electric light engines, far away below, keeping them going until no human being could do so a second longer, right until the ship tilted on end and the engines broke loose and fell down. The light failed then only because the engines were no longer there to produce light, not because the men who worked them were not standing by them to do their duty. To be down in the bowels of the ship, far away from the deck, where at any rate there was a chance of a dive and a swim and a possible rescue; to know that when the ship went, as they knew it must soon, there could be no possible hope of climbing up in time to reach the sea; to know all these things and yet keep the engines going, that the decks might be lighted to the last moment, required sublime courage. But this courage is required of every engineer, and it is not called by that name. It is called duty. To stand by his engines to the last possible moment is his duty. There could be no better example of the supremest courage being but duty well done than to remember the engineers of the Titanic still at work as she heeled over and flung them, with their engines, down the length of the ship. The simple statement that the lights kept on to the last is really their epitaph, but Lowell's words would seem to apply to them with peculiar force. "The longer on this earth we live, and weigh the various qualities of men, the more we feel the high, stern-featured beauty of plain devotedness to duty, steadfast and still, nor paid with mortal praise, but finding amplest recompense for life's ungarlanded expense, in work done squarely and unwasted days." For some time before she sank, the Titanic had a considerable list to port, so much so that one boat at any rate swung so far away from the side that difficulty was experienced in getting passengers in. This list was increased towards the end, and Colonel Gracie relates that Mr. Lightoller, who has a deep, powerful voice, ordered all passengers to the starboard side. This was close before the end. They crossed over, and as they did so a crowd of steerage passengers rushed up and filled the decks so full that there was barely room to move. Soon afterwards the great vessel swung slowly, stern in the air. The lights went out, and while some were flung into the water and others dived off, the great majority still clung to the rails, to the sides and roofs of the deck structures, lying prone on the deck. And in this position they were when, a few minutes later, the enormous vessel dived obliquely downwards. As she went, no doubt many still clung to the rails, but most would do their best to get away from her and jump as she slid forwards and downwards. Whatever they did, there can be little question that most of them would be taken down by suction, to come up again a few moments later and to fill the air with those heart-rending cries which fell on the ears of those in the lifeboats with such amazement. Another survivor, on the other hand, relates that he had dived from the stern before she heeled over, and swam round under her enormous triple screws, lifted by now high out of the water, as she stood on end. Fascinated by the extraordinary sight, he watched them up above his head, but presently realizing the necessity of getting away as quickly as possible, he started to swim from the ship. But as he did, she dived forward, the screws passing near his head. His experience is that not only was no suction present, but even a wave was created which washed him away from the place where she had gone down. Of all those 1,500 people flung into the sea as the Titanic went down, innocent victims of thoughtlessness and apathy of those responsible for their safety, only a very few found their way to the Carpathia. It will serve no good purpose to dwell any longer on the scene of helpless men and women struggling in the water. The heart of every one who has read of their helplessness has gone out to them in deepest love and sympathy, and the knowledge that their struggle in the water was in most cases short and not physically painful because of the low temperature, the evidence seems to show that few lost their lives by drowning, is some consolation. If everyone sees to it that his sympathy with them is so practical as to force him to follow up the question of reforms personally, not leaving it to the experts alone, then he will have at any rate done something to atone for the loss of so many valuable lives. We had now better follow the adventures of those who were rescued from the final event in the disaster. Two accounts, those of Colonel Gracie and Mr. Lightoller, agree very closely. The former went down clinging to a rail. The latter dived before the ship went right under, but was sucked down and held against one of the blowers. They were both carried down for what seemed like a long distance, but Mr. Lightoller was finally blown up again by a terrific gust that came up the blower and forced him clear. Colonel Gracie came to the surface after holding his breath for what seemed like an eternity, and they both swam about, holding on to any wreckage they could find. Finally they saw an upturned collapsible boat, and climbed on it in company with 20 other men, among them Bride, the Marconi operator. After remaining thus for some hours, with the sea washing over them to the waist, they stood up as day broke, in 2 rows, back to back, balancing themselves as well as they could, and afraid to turn lest the boat should roll over. Finally a lifeboat saw them and took them off, an operation attended with the greatest difficulty, and they reached the Carpathia in the early dawn. Not many people have gone through such an experience as those men did, lying all night on an overturned, ill-balanced boat, and praying together, as they did all the time, for the day and a ship to take them off. Some account must now be attempted of the journey of the fleet of boats to the Carpathia, but it must necessarily be very brief. Experiences differed considerably. Some had no encounters at all with icebergs, no lack of men to row, discovered lights and food and water, were picked up after only a few hours' exposure, and suffered very little discomfort. Others seemed to see icebergs round them all night long, and to be always rowing round them. Others had so few men aboard, in some cases only 2 or 3, that ladies had to row, and in one case to steer, found no lights, food or water, and were adrift many hours, in some cases nearly 8. The first boat to be picked up by the Carpathia was one in charge of Mr. Boxhall. There was only one other man rowing, and ladies working at the oars. A green light burning in this boat all night was the greatest comfort to the rest of us, who had nothing to steer by. Although it meant little in the way of safety itself, it was a point to which we could look. The green light was the first intimation Captain Rostron had of our position, and he steered for it, and picked up its passengers first. Mr. Pitman was sent by First Officer Murdock in charge of boat 5, with 40 passengers and 5 of the crew. It would have held more, but no women could be found at the time it was lowered. Mr. Pitman says that after leaving the ship he felt confident she would float and they would all return. A passenger in this boat relates that men could not be induced to embark when she went down, and made appointments for the next morning with them. Tied to boat 5 was boat 7, one of those that contained few people. A few were transferred from Number 5, but it would have held many more. Fifth Officer Lowe was in charge of boat 14, with 55 women and children and some of the crew. So full was the boat that as she went down, Mr. Lowe had to fire his revolver along the ship's side to prevent any more climbing in and causing her to buckle. This boat, like boat 13, was difficult to release from the lowering tackle, and had to be cut away after reaching the sea. Mr. Lowe took in charge 4 other boats, tied them together with lines, found some of them not full, and transferred all his passengers to these, distributing them in the darkness as well as he could. Then returning to the place where the Titanic had sunk, he picked up some of those swimming in the water and went back to the 4 boats. On the way to the Carpathia he encountered one of the collapsible boats and took aboard all those in her, as she seemed to be sinking. Boat 12 was one of the 4 tied together, and the seaman in charge testified that he tried to row to the drowning, but with 40 women and children and only 1 other man to row, it was not possible to pull such a heavy boat to the scene of the wreck. Boat 2 was a small ship's boat, and had 4 or 5 passengers and 7 of the crew. Boat 4 was one of the last to leave on the port side, and by this time there was such a list that deck chairs had to bridge the gap between the boat and the deck. When lowered, it remained for some time still attached to the ropes, and as the Titanic was rapidly sinking, it seemed she would be pulled under. The boat was full of women, who besought the sailors to leave the ship, but in obedience to orders from the captain to stand by the cargo port, they remained near, so near in fact that they heard china falling and smashing as the ship went down by the head, and were nearly hit by wreckage thrown overboard by some of the officers and crew and intended to serve as rafts. They got clear finally, and were only a short distance away when the ship sank, so that they were able to pull some men aboard as they came to the surface. This boat had an unpleasant experience in the night with icebergs. Many were seen and avoided with difficulty. Quartermaster Hickens was in charge of boat 6, and in the absence of sailors, Major Peuchen was sent to help man her. They were told to make for the light of the steamer seen on the port side, and followed it until it disappeared. There were 40 women and children here. Boat 8 had only 1 seaman, and as Captain Smith had enforced the rule of women and children only, ladies had to row. Later in the night, when little progress had been made, the seaman took an oar and put a lady in charge of the tiller. This boat again was in the midst of icebergs. Of the 4 collapsible boats, although collapsible is not really the correct term, for only a small portion collapses, the canvas edge, surf boats is really their name. One was launched at the last moment by being pushed over as the sea rose to the edge of the deck, and was never righted. This is the one 20 men climbed on. Another was caught up by Mr. Lowe, and the passengers transferred, with the exception of 3 men who had perished from the effects of immersion. The boat was allowed to drift away and was found more than a month later by the Celtic in just the same condition. It is interesting to note how long this boat had remained afloat after she was supposed to be no longer seaworthy. A curious coincidence arose from the fact that one of my brothers happened to be traveling on the Celtic, and looking over the side, saw adrift on the sea a boat belonging to the Titanic, in which I had been wrecked. The 2 other collapsible boats came to the Carpathia carrying full loads of passengers. In one, the forward starboard boat, and one of the last to leave, was Mr. Ismay. Here 4 Chinamen were concealed under the feet of the passengers. How they got there no one knew, or indeed how they happened to be on the Titanic, for by immigration laws of the United States they are not allowed to enter her ports. It must be said in conclusion that there is the greatest cause for gratitude that all the boats launched carried their passengers safely to the rescue ship. It would not be right to accept this fact without calling attention to it. It would be easy to enumerate many things which might have been present as elements of danger. CHAPTER VII